Right, welcome everyone. I'm Julie Lindsay and this is INF537, Digital Futures Colloquium. On this side of the world is the evening of August the 7th, and I welcome students to I think this is our fourth colloquium for the season, and I also welcome our guest, Dr. Ross Todd, who actually is Australian, but he's living on the other side of the world and has been for
almost
a long
20.
time. Yeah, almost 20 years, in fact. Greta, you say you can't hear me. I think everyone else can, though. Sorry. Can someone type in the message there for Greta? That's great. Greta might need to go out and come in again. So, look, I'm really delighted, Ross, that you're able to join us. I know, look, you're very busy travelling and doing all sorts of wonderful things this year, and you might tell us a little bit about your travels.
Sure.
And I really appreciate the fact that you've got up so early in the morning to be with us. So, look, I'm going to pass it over to you to take it away and introduce yourself perhaps with a little bit more detail and into your presentation. Thanks so much.
Okay, Julie and everyone, welcome. It's lovely to be here. I am on the East Coast, the northeast coast of the US, with, of course, a long background in Australia. I work as a professor at Rutgers University, a very large public university, just out of Manhattan in New York. We're about 45 minutes out of Manhattan, out of central New York City. And I'm in the School of Communication and Information. And I did all of my education, in fact, in Australia, including my PhD, which is quite a long time ago. But you are all at Charles Sturt University, is that correct? Yeah,
Yes.
or alumni of the university, or most are. And I have a long connection back to that university. Would you believe I completed my postgraduate diploma in school librarianship there at the then Riverina College of Education. And if you go back to the historical record of Riverina CAE, which then became Charles Sturt University in the early 90s, when all of the education reform took place, you'll see that I was the winner of the university medal in 1984 for academic excellence, and the only medal winner to come out of the school, I think, the School of Information Studies. So I work here at Rutgers. It's got 70,000 students, so it's not by any means a small university. In a city, New Brunswick, New Jersey, as I said, just out of Manhattan. And many of you will probably have some kind of connection as a childhood growing up in Australia. If you think of Johnson & Johnson baby powder, which is a kind of a life stay for children growing up. New Brunswick is not just the home of Rutgers University, it's also the world headquarters of the very large pharmaceutical Johnson & Johnson. And look out the window, you see its complex of buildings and so on. Anyway, so I bring a combination of thinking about the future in education. My background is in school libraries. That's where I started, although I work much more broadly. For the last 5 years, I've been actually the chair of the department here, the Library and Information Science Department. Was chair for 5 years, and I'm actually currently on a year-long sabbatical, which is fabulous. And I'll talk about some of the work that I'm doing because it is built around the broader concept that underpins your colloquium series, that of young people living and well-being in digital environments. And I'm focusing on children's safety, children and young people's safety in online environments, and I've got a research agenda and so on going underway. So I kind of called this, I'll move through, I've got a lot of slides here and I can talk endlessly and non-stop, but I'll move through them relatively quickly. So to just put out a bunch of ideas, these are just ideas that are on top of my mind at the moment as we think about where schools, where libraries. So I framed the whole thing around schools and around libraries because my work intersects with both of those. And I know that many of you are in positions within schools, have aspirations for building your own leadership capacity. So I bring together the notion of schools and the notion of learning and education and libraries into one thing. And I called it future tense, future perfect. You know, how do we even read the future? It's a lot of concerns about the way that education is going, lots of concerns about the way that technology is shaping our thinking, and how do we move forward in this kind of environment and construct a meaningful future. Just to give you a sense, and I can send through to Julie a kind of bibliography of stuff that you might want to look at, but there are two things that sort of have been playing on my mind for quite some months as I work through this sabbatical period and looking at kids' lives in online environments. You may well know the work of Donna Haraway. You know, the Cyborg Manifesto was written in the 1980s, a wonderful, wonderful feminist scholar who talked about this notion of the cyborg. This is, you know, if we go back to the 1980s and we're still beginning to struggle with the very large computer technology. We hadn't even got to the point of the whole laptop generation of technology. A Cyborg Manifesto, and she talked about the notion of the cyborg, the welding, the coming together of the human and the technology, and I'll come back to that in a little minute. The other work that I've been working through is a book by Mary Chaco, one of my wonderful, wonderful colleagues here at Rutgers, and this was published in 1916, sort of looking at the super connected, the world of our kids and the intense connections they have through the digital environment, and looking at how is this shaping our kind of very being, the techno-social life. And there are two sets of ideas that I just want to run by you, which I think are really critical as we begin to think about where things are going. In the Cyborg Manifesto, Donna Haraway, in presenting this notion of the cyborg, the coming together of the human and the machine as if they're almost one, is this notion, and a very critical notion, I think, of the breakdown of boundaries between human and machine. And we see this kind of happening in our social discourses already, the question of what is male and female, the question of self and other, the question of right and wrong. We're living this whole notion of what is truth and illusion, fact and fake news here in the US. And the fact that technology is playing a really critical role in challenging some of the major social, cultural, and individual forces that shape our very being. And I want to you know, in lots of ways, it's the technology that dominates our discussion. And I think that's emerging, in a sense, as a problematic arena. How do we engage with technology to come right back to the notion of the human, the human agency? How do we use this technology to foster the well-being of humankind? And that comes right back to this problematic of past tense, future perfect. And this comes right clearly in Mary Chaco's work in her book, The Superconnected, because she said, what's happened as we've begun to focus on technology over, you know, several decades now, that we've kind of set up a kind of false dichotomy. We talk about our real lives and we talk about our technological lives. We talk about the virtual cyberspace, even digital. We talk about the sort of, we've constructed this kind of polarization, this dualism. And she says it's, as we begin to think about as we move through to the future, that this is the problematic kind of breakdown of the way we think about our lives. She says digital life is simply real life, and she goes on to argue in her book that terms such as virtual cyberspace and digital are actually misleading because they imply something that is almost but not quite real. And she makes a really important point here, and we've all captured this kind of dualism because, we talk about digital natives, we talk about digital literacy, we talk about digital citizens as if they're kind of separate from the real world that we live in. And maybe there are problems around the use of those terms because there's a lot of attention, and I know even in the New South Wales education system, there's a lot of attention being given to digital citizens. But when I think about what's happening here in the US and the many problematics of social and cultural life here in the US, talking about citizens purely from the point of view of digital is a fragmented way. And, I think about aren't we on about developing citizens where the part of their life is digital, part of it is offline and online. They're really interesting demarcations that I think we need to begin to talk about. But what she comes back to is this notion, and I think this is really critical when we begin to think about digital futures, is that, we're being caught up with a whole lot of technological developments, and in many ways the technology comes to the front rather than the realities around human agency. And that's the critical point that I think I want to come back all the way to, this notion of human agency. And in some ways, I think we've kind of lost sight of humanistic study. When you go offline and if you download these PowerPoints, you can begin to see how many faces are in this diagram. Check and look very carefully, how many faces do you see? Where we've kind of become a little narrow focused, that it's about technology, and in many respects, we're losing sight that there is that dualism of the human. And my call in all of this is to come back to the notion of human agency, that this is how do we engage with the affordances and the dilemmas around technology to foster society, to foster human well-being. And I think that's a critical agenda that we need to come back to in our schools. And I guess the point comes out here in this slide that, in some ways we've lost out on humanistic study. I see here in the US, the whole funding for the arts and the humanities has been severely cut. And I think coming back to the central point of human agency as a key to the digital future, thinking about here, and these are kind of some of the core assumptions that I work with, as I think about where are schools going and where is education going. Schools and libraries, very clearly, I'm bringing the two together because I'm not quite sure the full directions that each of you are moving in. But schools and libraries as cradles of civilization and democratic society, they're kind of old terms, but they are at the heart of human agency. Our schools as breeding grounds for ideas generation. And also added in here the notion of disruption and intellectual discontent. You know, how do we use technology to disrupt our thinking? Because out of that disruption is the birthplace of engaging with the diversity of ideas, the foundation for critical thinking, argument, and debate. And it's also very easy for our kids to Google it and find it on the internet. So thinking about how do we use this technology as a breakdown of the sort of singular notion of the world to the diversity of ideas and aversion to dogmatism. So thinking about our schools and libraries as ideas and thinking networks rather than technological networks. That's the key point. We tend to focus on the development of the physical, mechanical nature of technology rather than the thinking network. And that whole idea extends then to, and I know that, Julie, this is part of your work, the notion of global learning, the building of social and collaborative opportunities. Again, this is not about technology per se, but it's about creating learning contexts that are local, distant, formal, informal, and so on. The notion of social and cultural networks. And then, of course, extending that, the whole broader sense of community. There's quite a lot of work going on in the library arena about libraries as communities. And so I want us to see, if we think really about humanistic study and the breakdown of a focus on technology and coming back to the thinking networks as social, cultural, and community networks, what we're doing is putting the agency, the human agency, back in what we're doing. And so what I think all of this comes together, and coming back to my title, Future Tense, Future Perfect, you know, here we're living in a really challenging and problematic information environment. You know, it lives its daily life here in the US, the banishing of truth, the suppression of ideas, the suppression of science. We see it unfolding in the whole climate debate here. How do we have the courage, the guts to live our values, ethics, and practices? And I think that really comes right back to the ideas in the previous slide, that our schools and our communities are part of social, cultural agency, building intellectual agency, building personal agency, building social and cultural agency, coming right back to the human side of education, that, you know, that in our roles is encouraging and nurturing. That's the breakdown of the technological dualism. Look at this slide. It's kind of, I took this picture last year in 2018. I was standing in the Tuileries Gardens in Paris, and it was on the 14th of July, and there was the flyover of all of the technology. And if you look at the slide, you know, trying to highlight the French tricolor, the tricolours of the French flag. If you look at the aeroplane to the left, it kind of got its messages wrong, you know, or was it deliberate, rather than, you know, there are only two blue rather than three blue? Somebody kind of got it wrong. Was it a joke? So how do we connect all of the thinking around human and empowering humans. Um, is this simply just a mistake? Is it? I can imagine the pilot of that plane was in a bit of serious trouble following on. I think it's a hoot, really. But, and I'll just draw out one example of where I see this this is the kind of, I'm pretty sure it's there in Australia, but certainly many of our schools here in the US are going through this makerspace movement. Whether you call them Hatch Space, Fab Labs, Maker Commons, Create, whatever you call them. But, and I see, I've actually just had a doctoral student complete her thesis on formal and informal learning in maker spaces, but it's one that's captured the attention of lots of schools, and schools are investing vast amounts of money, school libraries, public libraries, investing vast amounts of money in the creation of these spaces that are designed to be creative spaces, empowering young people to play and to innovate, to think critically, to problem solve. And it's a kind of part of this technological revolution that's happened. I'm not against maker spaces, don't get me wrong. I'll probably say some problematic things, but we've kind of it's an example of how we've kind of got caught up with the technological bandwagon. Schools have invested lots of money and time and technology around all of these, and much of this has been built on an airhead notion. We have very little research regarding the role of maker spaces in the creativity, innovation journey of our students. Yet we've all invested collectively millions of dollars in creating these spaces. And this is kind of technology pushing us forward without us stepping back and thinking, well, hey, what's the evidence? There's lots of rhetoric around it. There's many, many anecdotes about the value and many sort of personal individual observations. And I put these there. The PhD thesis, Xiaofeng Li was my doctoral student. She's in a university working now, but it's a really rich, one of the few sustained empirical works around the nature and value of maker spaces. But, raising questions about the human, how do we engage kids in authentic design, value-added information immersion? How do we understand what informal learning is? How do we make the connections between informal learning to the formal learning that's going to go on to schools? And I'm just putting it out there as an example of where I think we've not really thought all of this through. We've been catapulted into the kind of journey that's going around in the development of maker spaces, and without really thinking and engaging with the evidence that's there. And I think that's one of the critical challenges if we want to foster leadership in digital innovation. Then it's critical that we come back to the evidence. And I raised the question here: are we becoming myopic? When people talk about maker spaces, typically they talk about 3D printers. Again, the kind of broader discussion comes right back to the technology, and we all of this tinkering and all of the, and I'm being a bit critical here, of course, all of the bling that these kids are creating with 3D printers. Are we kind of returning to the industrial age factory? Where libraries are becoming bling centers and hardware stores. I don't know. I'm just pushing out ideas here. you know, but have we even begun to think about 3D printers, for example? It raises a whole new set of dynamics around plagiarism, what constitutes protected objects. Can you just go ahead and use a 3D printer to create a version of a Greek or Roman vase that's in the Louvre or a distinguished museum? Is that simply plagiarism? I don't know. So it raises kinds of, we haven't even thought about the human side of this, the ethics that are involved, and how we're using these to foster the development of thinking in this digital context. How do we connect it in much more powerful ways to the development of critical and reflective thinking? You know, I said here, connecting makerspaces to big ideas and to resource-based inquiry. We've got to get beyond the tinkering and the pouring out of another little digital object out of a 3D printer. And I know that kids get very excited about that, but what's the bigger humanistic agenda here to do all of this? The next thing that I sort of briefly want to talk about is this question of data. You know, we're being sucked into a data vortex. I see it happening in our schools here. I see it happening in the test-driven environment of schools, where communities are becoming repositories of large volumes of data. The whole agenda around the agenda around data-driven decision-making. And I'm not really quite sure. And I think, you know, here in my very own department, we have in our master's degree a concentration in data science. We teach data curation, we teach data analytics, we teach machine learning. And it's a societal development where we are being immersed in vast quantities of data. And our schools are drowning in data. There's test score data, there's community data, there's individual student data. And how do we begin to think about not losing sight of our kids and our faculty in this whole data immersion? How do we empower human agency through this data? And I talk about, you know, increasingly I see our schools and our libraries being engaged in data curation, the collection, access and management of data repositories. How do we authenticate this data? How do we archive it? How do we preserve it? How do we respond to the global emergence of data standards and policies? You know, and I see, you know, our school libraries are full of databases, information databases. I see the generation of databases where, as part of authentic learning, as problem solving, kids have access to repositories of data and are engaging in the kind of reflective, critical and analytical thinking of that data. But, you know, the broader questions in our schools of data quality, the ethics of handling data, and so on. How are school educators, not just school principals, technology managers, how are all of the school faculty being trained in engaging with school-based data that enables data, effective information discovery and retrieval? This comes right back to the critical question of, is it data, or how are we engaging with it in human agency? Of course, there's a whole lot of discourse around data literacy. But and I'm thinking that data literacy, we tend to apply it to teaching kids. But as uh, educators, as school staff, as school faculty, how are we being prepared to engage in in the development of our own capacity to engage with data, problem solving with data? How do we engage with school-based data to tell a meaningful story, this notion of data storytelling? What is our understanding as school educators around the appropriate use of data? How do we translate that data into meaningful, rich intelligence that can support and nurture the learning? And you know, I think we're kind of, I see a lot of discourses around teaching kids data literacy, and I see a really serious gap in our own education as educators in learning to engage with diverse, large-scale intersecting data that is going to be at the heart of how schools will do business. I don't think we can escape this whole data-driven agenda. And you know, you look at even things like Facebook, you know, and all of those awful quizzes that come across daily on your Facebook feed. You know, what kind of dog am I? Here, do a quiz. You know, what kind of tree am I? Um, these kind of nonsense personality things. And what we fail to understand is that who could care? They're collecting data about you and every keystroke you make in those kind of digital environments is contributing to vast, vast repositories of data. And how are we understanding that? How are our kids understanding that? And how do we empower the human agency? That's the critical reflective thinking that is going to take us all forward in this data-driven world. You know, and coming back to the sort of humanistic study approach, you know, and I see that this is emerging very clearly here in the US landscape, and the dreadful things that happen seemingly on a day-by-day basis. You know, social, cultural, the whole debate around immigrants and cultural identity and so on. And much of this, of course, is fueled by technology, the rapid media portrayal and so on. And in many respects, you know, I see another critical dilemma emerging that comes right back to how do we empower the individual? You know, questions around civil discourse, human rights, human agency, social justice, civic responsibility, equity of access to resources, technology, community building, diversity. I think in this arena of technology, rapid access to open information, questions around the authenticity and ethics of information, questions around fake news, all of these are driven by access to technology. And in many respects, how do we have discourses around social justice, civic responsibility, human rights, human agency? And I think if we, you know, if I think about the sort of digital landscape where we're going in the future, some of these ideas that I have on the screen are really critically important, and engaging our kids in the kind of social justice debates, diversity debates, commitment to the social good is pretty powerful. And I don't know whether many of you heard about the kind of race riots that took place here in the US, in a little town, Ferguson, Missouri. This is the scene, and of course, emerging out of that was our critical discourses around Black Lives Matter, humans matter. This is the scene in the street, in the town of Ferguson, and it was just a ghastly, horrible scenario that continues to play out in this country. And I wanted to just present to you Scott Bonner. Scott Bonner, he's a young man. He was the public librarian right in the public library, the municipal public library in the heart of Ferguson. He's barely out of graduate school. And we had him come to one of our graduate student colloquiums. And, here in this little public library, the municipal public library in Ferguson, the in a sense, the violence, the war, the horror was raging outside, and he kept his library open. And this was the statement, a simple statement: during difficult times, the library is a quiet oasis where we can breathe, learn, and so on. And I just, he was an example to me of somebody with absolute moral courage. He valued diversity, he valued human agency, he valued intellectual agency, he valued social and cultural agency. And as that kind of community war raged on with terrible consequences, he was there. And I think this is the kind of courage of living our lives as our digital futures are enacted. It's not going to be easy. And he was a wonderful young man. He came and talked to our students and just was such a powerful statement about the kind of leadership we're going to be confronted, I think, more and more by some of the problematic affordances of technology, and it's going to create scenarios that make us uncomfortable, that may well be horrific. How do we have the courage to live our lives with the kind of ethical leadership that we're going to be tested more and more on this, I think, as we come through. So, just to sort of bring this to a point, and I'll talk then a little bit about my own work. But how do we create, in this data-driven, intense, technology-driven environment, the prevalence of problematic information, fake news, whatever you want to call it, how do we use this to create a visible agenda for social and cultural diversity, inclusion, access, justice, and well-being? Because I think that's coming right back to the power of human agency. How do we create our schools as diverse information ecosystems, as knowledge ecosystems, as wisdom ecosystems, and as safe ecosystems? Because in many respects, technology is empowering us to come right back to the question of human agency. And if we put human and social and cultural and individual well-being at the front, I think we begin to think a little bit differently about some of the kind of conversations that we need to be having around technology. So that kind of, I'm as I look at what's happening here in the US, this notion of social, cultural, and personal agency, inclusion, access, and well-being is a critical discourse as we think about the digital futures. And I just hope that we can engage our school communities in some of those different kind of discourses. Let me just very quickly talk about some of my own work. I'm looking at children's safety in online environments, and that's the focus of my sabbatical this coming year. But and there's quite a lot of literature. Children, we know that kids are increasingly at a young age engaging in online environments. There's a whole lot of discourses now emerging around staying safe online. There's a whole lot of concerns raised by parents and practitioners. You know, there's kind of, as Livingston, one of the key scholars in this whole arena, has said, there's a whole lot of moral panic over kids being safe online. You know, the kids are engaging, and, you know, there are risks and there are opportunities. And typically, if you look at all of the discourses around kids' safety in online environments, they tend to be framed in terms of adult conceptions of risk, adult concerns around problematic content, sexual content, sexting, messaging, stranger danger, cyberbullying, the misrepresentation of personal data, you know, creating fake things and so on. So this, you know, I'm perhaps positing here that the whole arena around children and young people's safety in online environments is something that we need to think in many respects quite differently about, because it is framed in terms of adult concerns. There's almost no research, and this is part of the research that I'm doing. How do kids conceive of safety? How do kids, what are the practices that kids engage in? You know, we've got this whole population of young people in our schools, and we've not really even bothered to ask, well, what do you do to stay safe online? It's very much driven by adults. It's driven by deep concerns, and very clearly framed in terms of adults' conceptions of potential risks. And of course, it's framed by highly celebrated media cases, typically which involve one or two people. You know, you'll see the news headlines around, you know, a stranger danger incident. And this kind of is blasted across the media, and it evokes all sorts of anxiety and moral panic around all of this. Here's one in New Jersey. 16 alleged child predators use social media to lure kids for sex throughout New Jersey. And there's, you know, in many respects, this is part of the anxiety and the moral panic that has been brought on by the digital environment. And, you know, where is all of this going? And you know, what's happened is that we've kind of got this rush to teach digital literacy. And, you know, every organization, every school, almost every library are creating these kind of models of digital literacy as a response to some of these trends that are happening in relation to digital safety. And what is, and if you look at these models, you know, most are built on adult conceptions of what the problems could be, rather than really engaging with any large-scale data. And, you know, I'm all about evidence-based practice. I'm all about data-driven decision-making. And yet we're kind of pushing forward this agenda. And I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm just saying that perhaps the way we think about this agenda might be a little bit differently. Look at this picture. I love this picture. You know, this is in a country, the kids, you know, you see the sort of, you know, let's take a selfie. We don't have a camera. Let's use a shoe. You know, what's going on here? The kids are already pretending that they're living in a technological environment. If you go to the website there, you'll see all of the debate going around, you know, and the debate, is this a fake image or not? That's where people are talking about this image rather than thinking, what are the conceptions of childhood here? How is technology shaping what we think about childhood? How are we engaging in child-centered research that helps us understand what's going on? And that website will give you a link to lots of the arguments of whether this is a fake image or not. And in some ways, I think we've really missed the point about the affordances of technologies. So, you know, what I'm focusing on here is moving our thinking, and this comes right back to the opening remark around Mary Chaco. You know, it's not, we don't live separate lives, our offline world life and our online life. These are continuities. And if we think about kids, you know, we get, as adults, we get really concerned about our kids constructing fake identities online. At the same time, as parents, we've taught our kids to, you know, be creative, be innovative, be imaginative. Imagine you're a dinosaur. Imagine you're, you know, you're a princess. We teach our kids to, in an offline world, to be creative about identity. And as soon as we put them in an online environment, we're getting caught up in all of this moral panic. You know, that this, you know, our kids are creating fake identities and they're setting up, you know, meeting strangers and so on. So, and part of, and this is part of the problem of the dualisms, that we encourage kids to be different people in their offline environments, and as they bring that continuity into their online environments, we kind of get all kind of panicky and so on. And so I think in terms of the broader discourses, if we think about digital futures, how do we engage our kids, and how do we think about our kids, not in terms of the dichotomy of online and offline lives, but how do we support them and nurture the broader notion of digital well-being? And you know, how do we provide the capacity through our schools and our libraries to look after personal health, safety? How do we help them think about technology in humanity's best interest? How do we help them think about the affordance of technologies for personal, social, and cultural benefits, for building community, for fostering community actions, and so on? How do we use technology to create the real and digital futures for them? And I think that we're going to see some broader discourses around this arena of digital well-being, because it's emerging as a kind of more holistic thinking around around what are the affordances of technologies, and going beyond self to really look at how this empowers a larger discourse around self and community and the social and the broader social outcomes. I'll just very quickly refer to this. You might want to look at this study. It's a really, truly wonderful study. It's still ongoing. It's a study of 25,000 kids in 25 European Union countries, undertaken by 100 researchers. It's probably one of the most powerful studies that are there. And what it really talks about ultimately is, how do we think about kids' safety? And while there are lots of theories around safety, and you know, I'm not necessarily going to go into them, but as we begin to think about kids' safety, I want to draw your attention to number 4 and number 5. How do we develop in our schools a sense of safety in digital environments as collective mindfulness? How do we listen to the voices? How do we understand what kids are doing? How do we engage kids in the kinds of decisions we're making about the uptake of technology in schools and the kind of policies that surround their use? This notion of safety as collective mindfulness. Kids are completely absent if you look at much of the policy development, kids are completely absent in this discourse. But one of the core things that I wanted to come back to was this notion of, if we look at the broader discourses around safety, this notion of safety as resilience. And I love the work that's being done on resilience theory in psychology. How do we help our kids adapt well in the face of whatever is created in this digital environments? The notion of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, sources of risk. How do we develop resilience? And I think that's where I think if we want to create a really safe, welcoming and meaningful environment for our kids being online, this whole approach to developing resilience, what we tend to do is create this long list of long laundry list of digital skills that we've got to teach them. And I'm not sure that that laundry list of skills is the way we want to move forward. I just put this here. I'm getting quite close to finishing here. But I've been involved in a couple of pilot studies, which are mentioned here. I won't go through them. But kids do have a lot to say. We tend to disrespect kids as thinking they know nothing about life in an online environment. They know nothing about the dangers, when in fact, in the study that we did in the Philippines, kids have an amazing body of knowledge. Kids are not empty vessels that somehow we've got to pound into them notions of safety. Kids are well aware. In fact, in this particular study in the Philippines, I was simply aghast at their knowledge of some of the web, the dark web, their knowledge of websites. It was almost a bit frightening. But we have to respect the knowledge that our kids actually have. We've barely and rarely endeavored to find out what this is all about. But, this was emerging from this study. They have very specific, we're talking about 10 to 15-year-old kids. They have specific knowledge of aspects of the web that I don't even have. They have far more knowledge and understanding. But again, what was missing here is that being unsafe was primarily a technical problem. And coming back to the role of self. And this is what was missing in all of these studies. And it comes right back to the core notion that I spoke about at the very beginning. How do we empower human agency? How do we foster the development of self in online and offline environments? How do we foster the development of resilience? And probably I think this is my final slide. But, how do we develop the kind of school or library-based interventions? Interventions that are not based on exaggerations, that are not based on fear. Much of the media hype is around fear, stranger danger, sexting, pornography is going to destroy your mind. Just to say, in the large-scale European Union, there were some kids who said they benefited by access to pornography. It was their only form of sex education that they were getting. So how do we go beyond fostering the development of coping and resilience? This is going to be part of our lives. How do we help our parent community mediate? How do we educate our parents to go beyond just conceptions of moral panic around sort of high-profile media cases? You know, there was a study done, a review here in the US of looking at interventions, school-based interventions around digital safety, and many of these were kind of interventions that were almost bullying, you know, building fear and anxiety in kids and hoping that they might make an appropriate response, positive response from fear and anxiety. So how do we, the critical call centers on avoiding these kind of top-down interventionist, protectionist approaches to empowering kids to be resilient, to developing coping self-efficacy capacity. That's through awareness building, through resources. How do we provide the anonymous helplines? How do we, what was really interesting in the Livingston study is that kids never went to teachers to talk about any personal safety issues being online. Why? They didn't trust the teachers. The teachers are going to blab on them, if they come and confess a particular problem. So it's about coping and resilience, and how do we develop our schools as safe and trusted places? How do we develop our school libraries of safe places where there is trust? How do we build the open communication? So to sum up, it's about caring. It's about human agency. The ultimate obscenity is not caring, not moving forward. This is how I've always done it. This is how we've done it at the school, and we're not going to change. How do we take the time as educators to reflect on some of these emerging realities around the digital world, and how do we as individuals, and I think this is a real call for us as educators, to come back and think and reflect and reshape. It's all about, and I just highlighted here, I've run out of time, I know, it's all about duty of care. This was a photograph, looks like an apple. I paid by Apple Computers to take this. But this is just a sunset photograph I took. I was on the beach in Zanzibar in Central Africa. And, how do we take the time to reflect on the richness and diversity and the colour of our world? Because it is ultimately about the dawn of a new day. And anyway, I'll leave it there. I'll open it to some questions. Sorry, Julie, I went on, as you know, far too much.
Thank you, Ross. Look, I think there's some really good comments in the chat window there. And I think what I'm finding through the chat and through what you've been telling us and sharing with us, I think we all come from a diversity of experiences. And when you look at a place like Australia, and then, of course, the USA, but Australia, we have different education systems. We have different states with different policies. We have different leaderships.
We have 50 of them here.
Yeah. We don't have as many as you, but we do. We're so diverse. And then how do you bring all of this together so that, there's certainly not one learning experience across a country, is there? And this is another problem. But the word that comes to my mind, and I'm going to throw this open for some quick questions, but the culture of learning, I think, is very important here. What is the culture? And when you move from one school to another, those of you who have moved around different schools, you walk into a new school, it's a whole different culture of teaching and learning within that environment. So how does, the impact that has on how digital learning is embraced, how the attitudes towards student autonomy and agency, it's just, coping with this and then coming across with a message that is then understood in the same way across this diversity is really difficult as well. And Ross, you must encounter this all the time.
Every day.
Yes.
every day, you know. But I think it comes back to the sort of larger discourse in how are we in the context of our schools, in the context of the policies that are driving this school, how are we engaging in discourses around well-being? How are we providing the resilience and coping frameworks for our kids in this particular context to move forward and to grow and to live those kinds of lives? I don't think there's a simple, easy answer. I think that it's about engaging our kids far more in discourses about their future. We tend to impose their future on them. We are reluctant to engage our kids in kind of discourses about their lives, their well-being, and I think we have to. That creates different kind of dialogue dynamics in schools, in communities. But until we, and you know, until we begin to think about their voice, you know, if we look at contemporary childhood studies, contemporary childhood studies is about listening to the voice. It's about it's moving beyond the thinking that our young people are, and children in particular, are incapable of having a voice, capable of having a view. How do we understand it from there? I'm kind of greatly influenced by a lot of the contemporary work on childhood studies and engaging methodologies to tap into this. But you know, we start with our communities. We start with our voices, hearing the voices, because I think, you know, I don't know, I think our kids have lots of wonderful ideas. We don't just give them a mechanism for, first of all, hearing them, and then for creating the kind of structures that might enact some of their ideas. I don't know. I you know, how do we find a pathway in this rich diversity, in this rich policy structure as well?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I just think it's just such a crucial time to be talking about this. It really is, as we all get stronger connections to the internet, stronger, you know, reasons for connecting locally and globally. You know, we've got to work certain things out. We have to, rather than banning things like, you know, I think Karen put in the chat here, you know, Victoria banning mobile phones, and then of course, you know, we have different states that ban certain technologies that allow you to collaborate beyond the school. So, you know, the rationale behind that just eludes me, you know.
And you know, and part of the debate around kids' safety online, and you know, one of the top-down approaches is, of course, the whole filters on technology in schools. This is very, very problematic here in the US, that, you know, if your library wants to get funding from the government, you've got to, you know, you've got to have all of these guarantees of technological filters. You know, how do we teach our kids to deal with bad information?
To filter themselves.
You know, if what we're doing here is providing a technological solution. And look, I understand all of the arguments around providing a technological solution, but when do we confront our kids with the real world? If we're going to simply say, you know, you're banned from all of this, when do we construct and enable the learning environment that kids may well encounter problematic information? Kids may well, you know, be the victim of sustained sexting, or, you know, have unwillingly pornographic images provided for them. If we, you know, it's a really hard call, because if we ban all of this, when kids get out of the microcosm and the safe walls of the school, how do they learn? And I just love the work that's emerging at this point in time in terms of resilience and coping. It just, we can't, if we put technological bans, we're shielding these kids from a reality that, we're saying that this doesn't exist.
Yes.
And imposed a technological solution rather than a critical, reflective, how do I think this through? And, I don't know. I think it's, I think the banning of technology is just, it's a way of solving a problem in a problematic way.
It's baffling, isn't it? And we've got, Ross, we've got Fiona here who has a question for you about technology.
Sure.
States. Fiona, is your mic working? Go ahead.
Yes, it is now. Thank you very much, Ross. That was absolutely fascinating. I couldn't keep my head around all those questions that were coming. I can't wait to go back and listen to it and work through all those questions. No, it's great. Look, I just wondered, so we're seeing in Australia there are many states and different schools are banning phones and, kids having to lock their phones in pouches at the gates. And we've seen in France that France have also banned phones. What are the states doing? What's happening in the states? How are teachers dealing with how do teachers deal with the distraction of phones and the distraction of technologies? It's not just phones, it's messaging in classrooms. How do teachers deal with that?
Well, they're dealing with it exactly in the same way that Australia and France are dealing with. They're dealing with it by policies of restriction, and of course, this is actually causing a whole lot of parental outcry as well. Because, look, you think of this, just this past week with these kind of mass shootings. This is a horrific context to be living in. This is life in the US, and it just horrifies me, and it just aghast me. But how do parents, in the wake of this dreadful, parents want to know that their kids are safe. And if the kids can't access the technology in schools, they're locked away in lockers or pouches. So there is this kind of, this tension, past tense, future tension that it's going on. I think what we're only just beginning to really develop is, how do we engage with this technology? I'm not quite convinced at this point that we've developed our understanding of meaningful, productive pedagogy around technology. Because it is, and one of the problems is that it's fast and ever-changing. Technology is moving faster than the kind of pedagogies that we're developing. But I just think that there's got to be a great deal more, and I'm speaking as a researcher here, a large amount of time and energy and money put into how do we engage with these meaningful technologies. I'm totally convinced that by shutting them down is not a solution. Because what happens? Kids get out of school and what do? They're on their phones, they're on their networks, they're whatever. So you ask a really hard question. I don't know what the answer is, but I think we've also got to engage and for example, here in the US, banning phones in schools or putting phones in lockers. Most of this has actually happened without any kind of engagement of the kids. And I do come back to sort of contemporary childhood studies where there are voices and there are solutions that I believe our kids can provide, but we just don't listen to them. I don't know. I don't have any answers for you. I just think that how do we how do we engage? We've got to stop, I think, this top-down heavy approach. How do we engage? This is the sort of collective mindfulness idea. How do we engage all stakeholders in the creation of solutions and pathways and structures that might work much more effectively? When you don't have a voice in this, you tend to be disenfranchised. And I think that's actually what's happening with a lot of kids. It's happening with parents who are not being engaged in the voices of schools, in the determination of policies around technology. I don't know. Sorry, I don't think I've answered the question. It's not an easy question to answer.
Oh, I've loved your questions. It's fantastic. Very good.
I think the point is that we're having the conversation, and asking the questions. Whether we've got the right answers at the moment is not the point, is it?
Yeah, that's right. And, I imagine that many of you who are studying your program, of which this is a part, that, you are thinking and aspiring to really meaningful leadership roles in schools, in organizations. And I think that collective response, the collective mindfulness, that's what I think is really missing. An understanding of how all of the stakeholders come together and can share in the development of solutions and the ownership of those solutions. And I think kids have a really important role to play in all of this. I don't know, but having those conversations at multiple levels, multiple stakeholders, is really critical. I will say, talking about this whole arena of digital safety, most of the work on digital safety, nobody even defines what safety is. Safety is defined by adult concerns around the risks. And, as I've been doing my work in terms of safety in an online environment, the fundamental question is, well, what is safety? In fact, the vast body of literature around theories of safety, which I mentioned there, centers on the healthcare industry, centers on the automobile industry, and it centers on the airline industry. You think about it, and I'm a frequent flyer. I constantly get sort of surveys from the airline, which in many respects are about engaging the traveller as one of many stakeholders in the construction of airline safety. Of course, there's the technical aspects and the manufacture and functioning of airplanes. There's the safety, the how you message about safety, which involves your crew, how do passengers conceive of safety, and so on. And I just thought, the airline industry, of which, I travel a lot, is a really wonderful example of how an industry has built collective mindfulness, engaging multiple stakeholders, engaging multiple perspectives. And in many ways, I think that's a lovely microcosm of what we need education to be.
Interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so look, Ross, I think we probably need to finish up. Look, it's been absolutely wonderful having you. I really appreciate you getting up nice and early for us and seeing this on.
It's the city of New Brunswick, which I look out onto. It's quite wide awake now. So.
And I believe you're travelling again today as well, are you? You're taking off again?
Yes, but talking about airline safety, it is on my mind. Later tonight, I'm flying out of the US to Istanbul, and then connecting in Istanbul to Tashkent in Uzbekistan. I'm going to Uzbekistan for a week. So the question of safety is on my mind, but that happens later tonight. I'll be flying out of on a non-stop to Istanbul and then on to Tashkent.
Well, we wish you all the best. And look, I know you have been doing a lot of travel this year, and I just, go well, safe travel and all that. And look, you've certainly given us a lot to think about. So much appreciation.
There's a lot of stuff packed into those slides, so engage with them however you want. But it's really lovely to talk with you all and to see you. Thank you for coming to class at such an odd hour. This is life, isn't it, across the time zones?
It is.
But I want to wish you all well, and as you think things through and aspire to just beautiful leadership, caring leadership, that is part of your goal. So I wish you well, and thank you, Julie, for the opportunity to talk with you all.
Thanks, Ross. Okay.
My pleasure.
Great. Look, good night, everyone, and I'll send everyone the recording and the slides. Ross has offered to share his slides, and we will keep this conversation rolling along. Good.
So good night to you all.
Thanks, everyone.